Hello, everyone. This is Gabriel. I'm broadcasting from Dubai. And today, joining me on the other end of the camera is Professor David Kertzer. He's in Maine, in the US. And he's the author of many books, but today we'll be speaking about one particular book that I've been reading these last few days, which is The Pope Who Would Be King. Hello, Professor. Welcome.
Hello, how are you?
Just fine. Before we begin, let me show our viewers the cover of your book so that whenever they go on Amazon or to a local bookstore, they can find it there. And after hearing this conversation, I'm very sure that they will be very interested in reading this book. So in this book, you say that Pope Pius IX, or Pio Nono, as he's known in Italian, he's perhaps the most important of all popes in modern history. Now, why would you say such a thing?
Well, for various reasons. One is he was the longest serving pope for 32 years. His papacy was the longest of any pope, but not so much for its longevity, but the dramatic events that occurred during his papacy. For 1,000 years, the popes had presided over as secular rulers over the papal states. That's big swath of the Italian peninsula that stretched from Rome up through Bologna. And the popes were known as Pope Kings for that reason. So it would be during his papacy that the papal states would crumble and a modern Italian state would be formed. He would excommunicate the leaders of that state and call for regaining control, but of course the church never did. Also, as part of his experiences in trying to shore up the papacy, given the attacks on it, he called a Vatican Council and pushed the bishops to vote to the new doctrine, new official doctrine of the infallibility of the papacy, which of course we still have with us today. So those are a couple of the reasons.
When you say push, what exactly do you mean? Because there have been allegations that he was really aggressive about this, to the point that even withholding some bishops of not allowing them to go out of their rooms if they didn't vote in favor of this. And apparently, as you discuss in the book, this was a doctrine that was in people's mind in the Vatican or in the papacy for many centuries, but it hadn't been given like real serious consideration until he came. And of course, many bishops apparently were not completely convinced to go with this. So when you say that he pushed the bishops, tell us a little bit more about what that pushing really entails.
Yes, well, as you mentioned, the idea or the possibility of papal infallibility had been debated and around for a long time. So it's not as if it came out of nowhere, but it had never been adopted as official policy of the church and the Holy See. When I say he pushed it, as far as I know, he didn't lock anybody in their rooms and refused to let them out. But he certainly had very negative things to say about any of the bishops who were opposing him. And he made it pretty clear that they would potentially suffer consequences. Certainly, if you wanted to, as a bishop, be appointed to a more responsible position as bishop or become archbishop, much less cardinal, you wanted to remain in the good graces of the Pope. It's also, you need to put it in a historic perspective, it was part of a longer term process of centralization of power in the papacy, that this evolution from bishops having quite a lot of autonomy, control, and national churches, often in the past, it required the local king or ruler, a civil ruler to approve appointments, if not to bring up the appointments themselves as bishops. This move of all this authority centralizing it in the Vatican and the Pope, this has been going on for quite a while. But the proclamation of papal infallibility was certainly a highlight of that process.
Right. Would you say that this was a compensation for having lost temporal power when the papal states disappeared? I mean, had the Italian nationalists not succeeded in what they did, would we not have papal infallibility today?
Well, that's an interesting hypothetical. You know, as you mentioned, my book, The Pope Who Would Be King, it focuses on the fact that shortly after he became Pope, he becomes Pope in 1846. 1848, there are revolutions throughout much of Europe. And one of them was in Rome, where they wanted to get away from or do away with what they call the priestly rule and to have separation of church and state. And the Pope went into exile for several months before he could call on the Catholic armies of Europe to come and restore him to power. So this was a process that was going on already for a couple of decades, because that was 1848, the Vatican Council, where papal infallibility is going to be proclaimed, is convened in late 1869, and papal infallibility is proclaimed in the last days of Rome as the last vestige of the Papal States before Italian troops would conquer it in September 1870. So this was all a very dramatic period, not just for the church, but for the history of Italy.
Right. Now, to be clear, what does exactly papal infallibility mean? Because, I mean, people who are not Catholic, or even Catholics who are not all that educated about their own religion, they're not so sure about what it means. I mean, as you explain in the book, it doesn't exactly mean that whatever the Pope says, it's infallible. I mean, he has to speak ex cathedra, right? I mean, meaning from the chair. So what exactly does that mean?
Well, in fact, at that council, Vatican Council, where all the bishops of the world come together and this issue is debated, there are debates about exactly what it means. It wasn't clear to them either how far this extended. Did it extend to anything that the Pope opined about? And Pius IX wanted it to be quite broadly defined, but in the end, it was more narrowly defined, something of a compromise to get a majority. And so in the final version, it's confined as you said, ex cathedra, to matters of basic doctrine. So if the Pope is talking about, the political issues of the day, for example, that's not considered infallible. But if he's talking about issues of basic church doctrine, then it is infallible.
People who within Catholicism that get a bit defensive about this, and your book has a lot of criticism towards, this Pope in particular, but they tend to say, well, but the papal infallibility has only been used once in order to proclaim the Assumption of Mary. So, a Pope can talk about doctrine and so on, but that doesn't mean that he's infallible. He has to make sure that that he explicitly says so when he gives a particular, doctrine. And the only time that this has ever been done is when in the 20th century, the Assumption of Mary in both body and soul was proclaimed. So what do you say to that? Because that's a common claim that's made amongst Catholics.
Well, I think it's, there's maybe a purposeful ambiguity about when the Pope is infallible. This is a problem for the church because as times change, as society evolves, clearly the church has to some extent at least, change to be in harmony with the times. So it's a little bit awkward to have to defend everything popes in the past did. So one way out of this is to be a little bit unclear about where infallibility lies. And you may well be right. There was only once or twice that Pope specifically said, I'm now saying something that's infallible. But certainly those good Catholics or traditional Catholics who see in anything a Pope says dealing with doctrine as something they approve of, they would tend to view it as an infallible statement. And they'd have certainly certain support because in what was voted as papal infallibility in 1870, there was no specific qualification that the Pope had to specifically say, and what I'm saying right now is infallible.
Right. Well, I find it very ironic that maybe in 1870, the most conservative wing of the church was defending this. But now that we have a very liberal Pope, or at least that's the way he appears, the ultra-conservatives are now saying, well, he's not infallible in everything he says. So somehow, because now we have a liberal Pope, now they want to reduce or limit infallibility, right? Which, I mean, I find it very ironic. I don't know what your take on that is.
Yes, no, I think you're certainly right. And, I've also been doing work on Pius XII, another Pius, but he's the controversial World War II time Pope. And if you go any day on Twitter, which I occasionally do, and type in Pius XII, you will see the right wing of the church say he was the last real Pope. That actually, Pope Francis isn't even really the Pope. And therefore, nothing, any pope after the Pius XII, who was the last pope before the Second Vatican Council, where from the conservatives in the church, the most conservatives, that's where the church went wrong. So, there seems to be almost, I don't know whether we want to call it a game, but a certain kind of competition for what is really traditional, what is legitimate in the church that goes on, with conservatives charging the liberals, so-called liberals, with not authentically following Catholic doctrine, even though, as you say, by papal infallibility, you would think that the Pope Francis wouldn't be open to that kind of criticism.
Right. In your book, you discussed that when the papal state was abolished and the Italian kingdom came into being and so on, the Pope retreated to the Vatican and he chose never to leave again. And you explained that we may think now that that's where the Pope used to live, but you explained that actually popes used to live somewhere else in Rome, and because of that particular event, they moved into the Vatican. So how did this happen? Why did the Pope go to that particular area of Rome? And what was he trying to prove with that, or what was his intention?
Yeah, well, the history briefly is the popes were, recent popes had all been living, had their base not in the Vatican, but on the other side of the Tiber, in the Quirinal Palace. The Quirinal Palace, therefore, was the home of the Pope, but with the revolution in 1848, the Quirinal Palace, the Pope found himself surrounded, had to escape from it, flees to the Kingdom of the South in southern Italy, and as I mentioned before, calls on the armies of the Catholic powers to restore him to power, which they do several months later. When he finally goes back in 1850, so he'd fled in 1848, he returns to Rome in 1850. Now that Quirinal Palace has bad recollections for him, so he moves into the Vatican, which had previously served at other points in history as a residence of the Pope, so it wasn't that this was the first time, but they hadn't for quite a while before this. He then moves into the Vatican. That's 1848. Now, if you skip ahead to 1870, when Rome falls, he excommunicates the King of Italy, Victor Emmanuel II, and he says no good Catholic can recognize the legitimacy of the Italian state, which has only come about by defeating militarily the papal states. And as part of that protest, not only he, but his successors for several decades would not step foot outside the precincts of the Vatican, because to do so would seem to be recognizing the legitimacy of the Italian state. So it would be only 57, or how many years, 59 years later, 1929, that Mussolini, it would take Mussolini to negotiate an agreement with then Pope Pius XI, recognizing Vatican City as a sovereign entity, recognizing Catholic religion as the official religion of state. Previously, there had been separation of church and state. And that's when the Pope again would finally leave the precincts of the Vatican.
Right. And throughout all this period, as you say it in the book, he thought of himself as a prisoner, right? Pretty much.
Yeah, see, this became kind of famous that Pius IX described himself as a prisoner of the Vatican once the Italians had taken over Rome. And in fact, in the Catholic world in France and elsewhere, they would sell straw that they said this is in the prison bed that the Pope was made to sleep on. Of course, he was never a prisoner. He was free, and the new Italian state actually wanted to work out a deal with him, but he refused to negotiate and refused to recognize their legitimacy.
Right, but I wonder if to a certain point this was understandable, because during the times of Napoleon, I think one or two popes were actually like prisoners of Napoleon, and the conditions were not good. I mean, they were taken to the Alps and in bad conditions. So maybe public opinion in Europe had that idea of the popes that had been imprisoned by Napoleon, and they thought, well, here we go again. So is it understandable to a certain extent?
Yeah, that, in fact, it's important to keep that historical perspective, because for one thing, when you think of Pius IX in 1870, refusing to recognizing the legitimacy of the Italian state and saying, the Pope had to return to power in Rome and over the papal states. Now we say, that's ridiculous. What was he thinking? That was never going to happen. But in fact, it wasn't all that long ago that, as you mentioned, under Napoleon, twice actually, Pius VI at the end of the 18th century, and then in the early 19th century, Pius VII, were forcibly removed by the French forces and brought to France in the latter case. So they were not exempt, they weren't put into prison, but basically they were kind of hostages of the French. And Pius the Ninth himself had to flee in 1848 and then was restored to power. It brought an end to the Roman Republic, which briefly under Mazzini Garibaldi had pronounced separation of church and state and equality of all, including the Jews who were freed from the ghetto. So, you know, if in 1870s Pius IX thought that he should be returned to power, it's maybe not that surprising.
Right. Now, at the end of his life, as you tell in the book, he became extremely conservative, but it wasn't always like that. Mm-hmm. So apparently he had some liberal leanings, and then because of all these events and so on, he took a turn towards, you know, the extreme conservatism. And one thing that really got my attention reading your book is the things he condemns. So he issues some documents, I don't know if they're encyclicals or some document like that, and he says, freedom of speech, that's bad. Tolerance of other religions, that's also bad, and so on. So what was this document when he was condemning these modern tendencies, and how did the people take it in Rome?
Yeah, so you're right. So this was, I think, 1866, Quanta Cura. There was an encyclical, but with it, what more famous than the encyclical was the Syllabus of Errors, which was kind of an appendage to the encyclical. And as you described it, it was put in the form of no good Catholic can believe the following. These are the errors, the Syllabus of Errors. No good Catholic can believe in freedom of speech. No good Catholic can believe in freedom of association. No good Catholic can believe in freedom of choice of religion. And so forth. So this was an attack on modern times, on modern liberalism, on the Enlightenment. And for many decades, the church would wage a battle against what they referred to as modernity, and where they basically saw that with the French Revolution, that's where, you know, Western society went wrong, and we need to return to the old kind of medieval verities. This would lead to tension within the church itself over the decades, because clearly, although we're talking about, you know, particular Pope now and his perspective, but there were the Catholic world is very heterogeneous, and there were always dissidents, always people who took a more liberal position when these kinds of very conservative views were put forth by popes. And some of his successors would actually, Pius X in the early 20th century was, for example, known as a real battler against modernity, modern times, and had a kind of clerical network of priests throughout Europe trying to root out any Catholic clergy who were espousing these more modern ideas.
Right. Well, now, what you're describing, no freedom of speech, no freedom of religion, no freedom of association, that sounds like a dictatorship today. I mean, and today it would be severely rebuked by the United Nations, any country that engages in this type of thing. I suppose the 1870s were different times, but, you know, it's not so far removed from our time. So how is it perceived worldwide? Because, I mean, in the rest of Europe and in the United States even more so, freedom of speech was valued. So how was the Pope perceived? Was he perceived as a dictator? Because, I mean, basically that's what his temporal power was about. I mean, these things you're describing are typical of a dictatorship.
Yes, well, you know, you mentioned that when Pius IX first came to the papacy, he was seen as open to modern times, as in fact something of a liberal. His predecessor, Gregory XVI, was a well-known reactionary. And the rulers of the other countries of Europe were looking at the Pope and the Papal States thinking, you're not going to survive unless you adapt to modern times. This kind of reactionary medieval perspective is a disaster. I mean, the previous Pope, for example, wouldn't let railroads in. He thought railroads were the work of the devil and so on. So initially, Pius IX, who also was relatively young when he became Pope, hence serving 32 years later, was seen to be open to modern times. And there was the experience of the Roman Revolution and fleeing Rome, and the advice he was getting from all his cardinals were initially much more conservative than he was, that your idea of trying to adapt to modern times is a big mistake. We've got to believe in the very eternal verities of the church. These don't change, and so on. So there was this conflict with the rulers, and infallibility, of course, especially angered the various kings, monarchs, and other rulers in Europe that had Catholic populations, because it would seem to indicate that their Catholic populations owed, more allegiance to the Pope than they did to themselves, which clearly they didn't appreciate.
Right. You talked a while ago about the Jews, and as you describe in the book, he also had some turbulent relationships with the Jews of Rome. And I think you wrote a book about the particular case of Edgardo Mortara. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. Well, the case of Edgardo Mortara is a case in the Papal States in its last days, actually, 1858. In 1858 in Bologna, the Inquisitor, this is one thing that surprises people, that still in the mid-19th century, there was still an Inquisition. The Inquisitor heard a rumor that in a local Jewish family, the teenage illiterate Christian servant girl had baptized a boy, a small child. And because it had long been the church position that a baptized child was considered Catholic, didn't matter that he was baptized against his parents' wishes. In fact, the parents didn't know about it. And because he was Catholic, could not be raised by Jews, because then he'd be guilty of apostasy. He'd become a Jew and not a Catholic. So he was ordered by the Inquisitor, who had police power because it was the Papal States, sent the police to the home. The shocked parents, respond to the knock at the door when the police come and ask for their 6-year-old child. They knew nothing about this supposed baptism. The boy is taken and sent to Rome to a church institution that had been set up, House of the Catechumens, set up to convert Jews and Muslims, not just Jews, back from the 16th century. And there followed a huge battle. In the past, this had been not uncommon that Jewish families in the Papal States were subjected to this kind of taking their children away due to forced baptism. But now times were changing, and this resulted in kind of worldwide protests in the United States and in Europe. The emperor in France was protesting. But the Pope held on to the boy, who refused to return him, and the child ultimately becomes a priest and devotes part of his adult life going around preaching in 7 languages, trying to convert Jews, using his own experiences.
And he never did he ever see his parents again?
He saw, so his in 1870, so he's taken in 1858 to Rome. Remember, Rome remains in the hands of the papacy till 1870. In 1870, his father races behind the Italian troops that are conquering Rome from the Pope to see his son, but his son, hearing that his father's trying to come and get him, he's now 19 years old, from age 6, has been in church institutions. He flees, leaves the country. His father would kind of die disillusioned, but his mother lived longer, and his mother did meet with him when he was a priest. And in fact, he tried to, well, first of all, he tried to convert his mother, and but was unsuccessful in that. But he continued to try to have relationships with his family when he'd visit Italy. Not all his siblings were that happy with him, given how he had, from their point of view, destroyed their parents and caused such unhappiness. But he, of course, thought...
Yeah, but he was a victim too. I mean,
Right. So today we, could talk about indoctrination or brainwashing or whatever, and being taken at age 6 from your parents and your siblings. Of course, the official church narrative at the time was no sooner was he freed from the influence of his Jewish family than the effect of baptism took hold, and he immediately wanted to spend as much time as he could in churches and thank God for his good fortune to be out of the Judaic clutches. So there were 2 different narratives of this story.
Right, but as far as I know, there is some controversy regarding his memories, right, or his memoirs, because apparently he seems happy in what he wrote, and he was grateful to the Pope for the Pope's decision, right? But I know that you wrote an article, I don't remember for what journal, saying that that memoir was doctored, or at least
Yes.
some passages were. So tell us a little bit about that, and we'll close it. We'll leave it off there.
Okay, yeah, this was an article. If anybody's interested, it's available online at the Atlantic. I've written a few things on these issues for the Atlantic magazine online. So a few years ago, a well-known, at least in Italy, well-known Catholic conservative journalist, Vittorio Messori, published what he represented as the autobiography of Edgardo Mortara, that Edgardo Mortara had actually written. Then a couple of years ago, an English edition of this was published. That led to quite a lot of publicity, especially in the conservative Catholic press in the United States. And this led me to write my rejoinder, because I found that same document. What it was is, when Edgardo was in his 30s, he was in Spain. He wrote a memoir about his life in Spanish, and it can now be found where I found it, the same place this author, Italian author, did, in the monastery of his religious order in Rome. And what I discovered is that even in the Italian edition, in the English edition, strangely, rather than being a translation from the original, was a translation of the Italian translation published by a major Catholic publisher in the United States, Ignatius Press. But first of all, it's doctored. The published version contains many, many sentences that were not in the original. Secondly, many of the original statements were changed. For example, he says various kind of anti-Semitic things in his anti-Jewish views, and these were all excised from the published version, and he made various mistakes. And these are all changed to be corrected to make it look like this is more accurate. The other thing about that memoir is it's not only erroneous in its history because of being doctored, but also because, what did he remember about what happened to him, or what did he even know about what happened to him when he was 6? He had developed this narrative, which he used in his sermons, this inspirational story, but a lot of it was invented. So I was able to identify various of the more important inventions in that. So what was curious is that became quite a large controversy in the United States over the last couple of years. So this case from 1858, you wouldn't think it would be particularly relevant today, but an archbishop got involved, a major New York Times columnist got involved, and the controversy goes on because it actually gets back to a bit the papal infallibility and so on. The notion of the Pope Pius IX putting religious belief above political exigency. That yes, it would have been politically wise for him to release the boy to his family because he was, for various reasons, getting all this political pressure and bad press, but he didn't think he could, because the higher authority was the divine authority, which said, no, this boy is Catholic, can't be returned to a Jewish family.
Right. Well, this remains very relevant because just today there was a hearing for this Supreme Court candidate, and one of the issues is whether or not her Catholic beliefs will actually get in the way of her political and legal decisions. But anyway, that's another subject. Just one final thought, and we'll leave it there, Professor. What's the statehood? What's the status of sainthood for Pius IX? In the book, you discuss that John Paul II tried to work a compromise with both liberals and conservatives regarding his canonization. He's not a saint yet, but do you think he will become one? And what's the deal with that inside the Vatican?
Well, in the year 2000, the then Pope John Paul II, this was celebrating the second millennium, the year 2000, decided on the same day to beatify, which is the first of the two steps, or the penultimate step before canonizing someone as a saint, 2 of his predecessors. One being John the 23rd, who's the kind of liberal icon who convened the Second Vatican Council, but the other, to kind of balance it, find the conservative hero, chose Pius IX. And so he was beatified in 2000, but as you indicate, my last recollection is that final step of making him a saint had yet to happen. I mean, one other curiosity is that it was not all that common to turn popes into saints until pretty recent times. It happened every 200 or 300 years. Now it seems if you're a pope and you haven't been made a saint, there's something wrong with you. So, this is also a whole other subject that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, but I mean, this is another example of how politics gets involved here with religiosity, because I mean, you're supposed to prove a miracle and so on. So, I wonder how could these miracles be proven so fast, right? I mean, and
Well,
obviously there's a political interest behind that. It's not about the miracles.
yeah, I guess, if 1,000,000 cancer patients prayed invoking your name for a miracle, and 2 of them had remission, you'd have 2 miracles and we could make you a saint.
Right. Yes. Statisticians talk about the law of big numbers. So, it is bound to happen. Professor David Kertzer, it's been my pleasure. Before we go, let me show again an image of your book so that our viewers know where to find this book after having heard this conversation. It's been my pleasure, sir, and all the best to you. And I look forward to reading more of your books.
Well, thanks very much. Enjoyed
All right.
talking to you.
Yes.
Bye-bye.